They called them soft, pampered, incapable of real fighting. Japanese military doctrine in 1942 held that American soldiers were too materialistic, too individualistic, and too spiritually weak to endure sustained combat. Their propaganda pamphlets taught that Americans feared death and relied on material superiority rather than spiritual incentive in battle. Japanese officers told their troops that when the time came to face Americans in ground combat, the individualistic Westerners would simply fold up and break. Then came Guadalcanal. Over 6 months of savage jungle warfare, Japan committed roughly 36,000 troops to that pestilent island in the Solomon Chain. Approximately 25,000 of them never left. More than 3/4 died not from American bullets but from starvation and disease, their bodies rotting in the jungle while they waited for supplies that never came. The survivors renamed the island Gato, written with the character for starvation. And when Japanese destroyers finally evacuated 10,652 skeletal survivors in February 1943, it marked the first retreat in the history of the Pacific War. But the numbers alone do not tell the story. What happened on Guadalcanal was something far more devastating to Japan than a mere military defeat. It was the death of a myth. The foundational belief that had guided Japanese strategic thinking since Pearl Harbor, that Americans lacked the spiritual fortitude for brutal ground combat, died in the jungle alongside those 36,000 soldiers. And what replaced it was a new and terrifying understanding of exactly what kind of enemy they faced. This is the story of how American Marines taught the Japanese military a lesson it never forgot, a lesson written in blood, delivered at bayonet point, and confirmed in the agonized diary entries of soldiers who died with nothing in their stomachs but jungle grass and the bitter knowledge that everything they had been taught about their enemy was wrong. The Japanese military entered 1942 drunk on what their own generals called senshubyo, victory disease. In 6 months, they had conquered 1/7 of the globe. Singapore's 85,000-strong garrison surrendered to a far smaller Japanese force of roughly 35,000. The Philippines fell. The Dutch East Indies collapsed in 3 months. Burma was overrun. Every engagement confirmed what Japanese indoctrination had taught for years. Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe declared on NHK radio in October 1937 that Western people are materialistic, but Japanese people are spiritual, more sacred, sincere, and clean. War Minister Hideki Tojo authored the Senjin-kun Military Code in January 1941, urging the spirit of self-sacrifice on soldiers, commanding them to not consider death. By 1942, the message had become an article of faith. Japanese spiritual power, seishin, could overcome any material disadvantage. This was not mere rhetoric, it was operational doctrine. A propaganda pamphlet distributed to Japanese soldiers called The Psychology of the American Individual taught that Americans had no thought of the glory of their ancestors and feared death. Americans were daredevils in search of publicity who could not sustain themselves when separated from their comfortable material world. The pamphlet explained that American soldiers would crumble when deprived of their luxuries, that they lacked the inner steel that came from centuries of warrior tradition. This ideology produced what Lieutenant Colonel John W. Whitman later identified as its most dangerous consequence: systematic intelligence failure driven by ideology. When Japanese officers assessed enemy strength, they saw what they expected to see rather than what was actually there. Japanese planners estimated the Singapore garrison at 30,000 men. The actual number was 85,000. They estimated MacArthur's Bataan army at 25,000. The actual number was 80,000. They estimated the Midway garrison at 750 men. The actual number was 3,027. As Whitman wrote, the Japanese could grasp American quantity, but they failed to conceive of American quality mated to incredible quantity: fighting spirit, sound strategic minds, managerial adeptness, and timely globe-circling logistics. Even Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the most clear-eyed of Japan's senior leaders, underestimated American resolve. Yamamoto had lived in America, studied at Harvard, and traveled extensively across the United States. He knew American industrial capacity firsthand, yet even he miscalculated. In his presentations of the Pearl Harbor Plan, he expressed hope that devastating the Pacific Fleet would render the American people so dispirited that they would not be able to recover. He warned Prime Minister Konoe in a letter that in the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success. Yamamoto understood the mathematics of American industrial production. He had toured American automobile factories and oil refineries. He knew that American shipyards could build vessels faster than Japan could sink them. What he failed to grasp was American determination to keep fighting until the mathematics took effect. The war continued. American factories began churning out ships, aircraft, and weapons at rates that Japanese planners had dismissed as propaganda. By late 1942, the production gap that Yamamoto had feared was becoming reality. But the Japanese military, intoxicated by early victories, remained blind to the implications. Guadalcanal itself seemed an unlikely place for a decisive confrontation. The island stretched 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, covered in dense tropical jungle, infested with malaria, and populated primarily by crocodiles and mosquitoes. The Japanese had begun building an airfield there to extend their reach toward Australia and threaten Allied supply lines. American strategists recognized that if Japan completed that airfield, the entire South Pacific would become untenable. The decision to attack Guadalcanal was rushed, improvised, and nearly cancelled multiple times. The 1st Marine Division had been assembling in New Zealand, with units scattered across the Pacific. The 7th Marines were in Samoa. The 5th Marines had just arrived at Wellington in June 1942, and the 1st Marines were not scheduled until July. They were thrown into combat with inadequate supplies, incomplete intelligence, and no clear understanding of Japanese strength on the island. What they lacked in preparation they would make up in determination. And when Imperial General Headquarters learned on August 7, 1942, that Marines had landed on Guadalcanal, they dismissed it as a reconnaissance in force. An inconceivable offensive just 8 months after Pearl Harbor, when Japanese planners assumed it would take Americans at least 12 months to mount any counterattack. The landing force of nearly 11,000 Marines was dismissed as impossible. Tokyo believed it must be a raid, perhaps a few thousand men at most who would soon withdraw. They were catastrophically wrong. The destruction of the Ichiki detachment on August 21, 1942, was the first concrete evidence that Japanese assumptions about American fighting capability were catastrophically wrong. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki was exactly the kind of officer that victory disease had created. A former instructor at the Imperial Army Infantry School, he possessed what historians Myron and Susie Harries described as a fondness for the night attack, a low opinion of the American Marine, and an exaggerated faith in his own powers. Ichiki landed at Taivu Point on August 19th, with 916 men of the 28th Infantry Regiment's 1st Echelon. This was an elite unit with a lineage stretching back to the Russo-Japanese War. These were not green conscripts, but experienced soldiers who had fought in China. They believed themselves invincible. At Truk, Ichiki had been briefed that 2,000 to 10,000 Americans held the beachhead. He was explicitly ordered to avoid frontal attacks and wait for reinforcements. Ichiki disregarded every instruction. Japanese officers had described U.S. Marines as effeminate and cowardly. So supremely confident was he that his men carried only 7 days' rations, expecting to overrun Henderson Field on their second night ashore. Consider what this decision reveals. Ichiki genuinely believed that fewer than 1,000 Japanese soldiers could overwhelm what he estimated might be as many as 10,000 Americans. This was not tactical incompetence. This was ideological blindness made manifest. He did not wait for his second echelon of 1,100 troops, or Kawaguchi's 35th Brigade. He marched his 916 men straight into the defensive perimeter of approximately 11,000 Marines. On the night before the attack, Ichiki sent a small patrol forward to probe American defenses. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Getger had been killed in an ambush on August 12th, 9 days earlier, and the Marines were on high alert. The patrol was detected. 3 Marines died in the skirmish at Coley Point, but the Japanese lost 3 men as well, and the Americans knew an attack was coming. At 01:30 on August 21st, a Marine fired a green flare for illumination, revealing Japanese troops approaching across the sandbar at Alligator Creek. Marines had misidentified the creek as the Tenaroo River, and the name stuck. The battle would forever be known as the Battle of the Tenaroo, despite the geographic error. Ichiki's troops stormed across the narrow sandbar in what historian Henry Shaw described as a screaming, frenzied display of the so-called spiritual strength which they had been assured would sweep aside their American enemy. They expected the Americans to break and run at the first bayonet charge. Instead, they ran directly into the 2nd Battalion 1st Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock, backed by two 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister shot. Each canister round contained 128 .30 caliber lead steel balls. These weapons were essentially giant shotguns. Pre-registered 75mm and 105mm artillery completed the defensive network. Every approach had been mapped, every range calculated. The sandbar became a killing ground. First wave, approximately 100 men cut down within minutes. The canister rounds tore through massed infantry with horrifying efficiency. Second wave at 0230, 150 to 200 men, nearly wiped out. At 0500, Japanese soldiers attempted to wade through ocean surf to attack up the beach and were decimated by interlocking machine gun fire from positions that had been carefully sighted for exactly this contingency. At dawn, the Marines counterattacked. This was not the behavior Japanese doctrine had predicted. Americans were supposed to hunker down defensively, to rely on their material superiority, to wait for reinforcement rather than close with the enemy. Instead, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 1st Battalion 1st Marines crossed Alligator Creek upstream and enveloped the survivors from the south. 4 or 5 M3 Stuart light tanks from Company B, 1st Tank Battalion, charged across the sandbar into a coconut grove, crushing Japanese soldiers as they advanced. The tank crews reported that Japanese soldiers threw themselves at the vehicles, trying to stop them with their bodies. Henderson Field aircraft strafed the fleeing remnants. There was no mercy. The Marines had seen what the Japanese had done to prisoners elsewhere in the Pacific. They were not inclined toward clemency. By 5 in the afternoon, all resistance had ended. Approximately 789 of 917 Japanese were dead. Only 15 wounded prisoners were taken. Marine casualties were 34 killed and 75 wounded in the main battle, with 3 additional killed in the patrol action on August 19th. The kill ratio exceeded 20 to 1. Nothing in Japanese tactical doctrine had prepared them for such a disaster. Ichiki burned his regimental colors, though some Japanese survivors later insisted he was actually killed in action during the fighting. The truth may never be known. When survivors radioed Rabaul that the first echelon of the Ichiki detachment was almost annihilated, Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Matsumoto at 17th Army Headquarters called it a false report. 2 days later, Headquarters still believed Ichiki's force was in good shape near the airfield. The ideology that had caused the disaster now prevented its recognition. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, who would later command the Tokyo Express destroyer runs, reflected bitterly on this disaster. This tragedy should have taught us the hopelessness of bamboo spear tactics. It did not teach them quickly enough. The Japanese response to this catastrophe was not to reassess their assumptions. It was to send more men and repeat the same mistakes on a larger scale. The Americans, meanwhile, learned their own lessons from the battle. They had discovered that Japanese soldiers would not surrender even when hopelessly trapped. They had seen wounded Japanese feign death and then kill Marines who approached to offer aid. They had watched Japanese soldiers pull the pins on grenades and wait for Americans to come close. These discoveries hardened the Marines. Future battles would offer even less quarter. Henderson Field, the airstrip that the Japanese had been building when the Marines landed, became the center of American resistance. Named for Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway on June 4, 1942, the field received its first aircraft on August 20th, the day before Ichiki's attack. 31 Marine aircraft, 19 F-4, F Wildcats, and 12 SBD Dauntlesses flew off the escort carrier USS Long Island and landed that afternoon. From that point forward, American control of the air over Guadalcanal during daylight hours gave the Marines an advantage that Japanese ground tactics could not overcome. Japanese ships could approach only at night. Japanese troops could move only under cover of darkness, and American aircraft could hunt them relentlessly from dawn to dusk. The battles of September and October 1942 followed a grim escalation pattern. Each time the Japanese attacked with larger forces. Each time they underestimated American strength. Each time they were destroyed. The lessons of Alligator Creek were simply ignored, attributed to bad luck or Ichiki's personal failings, rather than fundamental errors in Japanese strategic thinking. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, commanding the 35th Infantry Brigade, landed approximately 6,000 troops for a September assault on Henderson Field. He believed only 2,000 Marines held the island. The actual number exceeded 12,000. Kawaguchi had fought in China and Borneo. He knew jungle warfare, but he knew nothing about the kind of enemy he was about to face. So confident of victory was Kawaguchi that, according to historian Robert Leckie, he brought his dress whites to Guadalcanal to wear when receiving Vandegrift's surrender. Those dress whites were captured by Marine raiders during a preemptive raid on his supply base at Tasimboko on September 8th, along with large quantities of supplies and equipment. The raiders sailed back with Kawaguchi's fancy white uniform nailed to the masthead. Kawaguchi declined an offer from 17th Army headquarters for an additional infantry battalion. He was certain he had more than enough men. He requested warships be stationed offshore to destroy any Americans who attempted to flee from the island. He genuinely believed that after his attack, the only American action would be a desperate attempt to escape. On the nights of September 12th through 14th, Kawaguchi's center body of approximately 3,000 men attacked down a jungle ridge south of Henderson Field. The position would become known as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge, named for the man who held it. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, known as Red Mike for his red hair and sunburned complexion, commanded roughly 840 Marines from the 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the depleted 1st Parachute Battalion. These were elite troops, hand-selected volunteers who had trained specifically for the kind of close-quarters jungle fighting that Japanese doctrine assumed only Japanese soldiers could master. The raiders had been formed specifically for amphibious raiding operations, drawing the toughest and most aggressive Marines from across the Corps. The Para-Marines had jumped into combat from aircraft, a rare and dangerous specialty. Both units had trained harder and longer than regular infantry. Edson himself was a legend among Marines. He had fought in Nicaragua in 1928 and won the Navy Cross there during the Coco River Patrol against Sandino's forces. He was known for leading from the front, for sharing every danger with his men, for remaining calm under fire when other officers would have broken. On the ridge that would bear his name, he would prove why his men would follow him anywhere. Edson had anticipated the attack. He had positioned his men on the high ground and registered artillery on every approach. What followed was among the most ferocious infantry combat of the entire Pacific War. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers surged up the ridge in darkness, screaming battle cries. They came in mass formations, exactly as doctrine prescribed, expecting the American defenders to break under the psychological pressure of a bayonet charge. The Americans did not break. Edson, continuously exposed to fire, walked the lines throughout the night. On the afternoon of September 13th, between the first and second nights of fighting, he stood on a grenade box and told his exhausted men, "You men have done a great job and I have just one more thing to ask of you. Hold out just one more night." Forward observers from the 11th Marines directed 1,992 rounds of 105mm howitzer fire at ranges as close as 200 yards from friendly lines. The shells fell so close that Marines could feel the concussion through the ground. Japanese troops penetrated to within yards of the airstrip itself, before being driven back. Major General Alexander Vandegrift later stated this was the only time during the entire campaign he had doubts about the outcome. If the Japanese had broken through, Henderson Field would have been overrun. Without the airfield, the American position on Guadalcanal would have become untenable. The ridge held. Over 600 Japanese were killed in the immediate area. Bodies lay in heaps where machine gun fire had caught them mid-charge. Total brigade casualties reached approximately 1,500, including hundreds of wounded who would die in the jungle over the following weeks without medical care. Combined Marine losses from both Raider and Parachute battalions were approximately 57 killed and 232 wounded, with the on-site memorial recording 40 dead and 123 wounded from the Raiders and 17 dead and 109 wounded from the Para-Marines. Edson received the Medal of Honor for his leadership during those terrible nights. Kawaguchi, retreating into the jungle, would later deliver his bitter verdict. Guadalcanal is no longer merely a name of an island in Japanese military history. It is the name of the graveyard of the Japanese army. Unlike his superiors, Kawaguchi had learned, but by then it was far too late. 6 weeks later, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake determined that the failures of Ichiki and Kawaguchi were due to insufficient force, not flawed doctrine. He landed personally on Guadalcanal on October 9th, determined to succeed where his subordinates had failed. Between October 1st and 17th, Japanese convoys delivered approximately 15,000 additional troops, giving him a total of roughly 20,000 men, including the elite 2nd Sendai Division, one of the finest units in the Imperial Japanese Army. Hyakutake was so confident that staff officers prepared for an American surrender ceremony with the code signal Banzai. Japanese intelligence estimated 10,000 Americans on the island. The actual number exceeded 23,000. Once again, ideology had corrupted intelligence. Once again, Japanese planners saw what they expected rather than what was there. The October 23rd through 26th Battle for Henderson Field produced the campaign's most iconic acts of American heroism. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Puller, known as Chesty for his barrel-chested physique and aggressive style, held a mile-long front in driving rain with his 1st Battalion 7th Marines. The defensive line was thin, far thinner than doctrine prescribed. But Puller had positioned his machine guns for interlocking fields of fire and registered every approach with artillery. Sergeant John Basilone commanded 2 sections of water-cooled 30-caliber Browning machine guns. Born in Buffalo, New York on November 4, 1916, he had grown up in Raritan, New Jersey, the 6th of 10 children, in a working-class Italian-American family. Before the war, he had served in the Army with the 31st Infantry in Manila, where fellow soldiers gave him the nickname Manila John because of his stories about the Philippines. He had re-enlisted in the Marine Corps in July 1940 because he missed the military life. Now he would become one of the most decorated enlisted men in Marine Corps history. Basilone fought for 3 days and nights without sleep. When one section was knocked out with 2 killed and 3 wounded, he gathered a machine gun and approximately 90 pounds of weaponry and ammunition combined and carried it 200 yards through continuous fire to the silenced position. He opened fire point-blank into the massed Japanese attackers. Bodies piled so high in front of his guns that Marines had to clear them to maintain fields of fire. The Japanese kept coming in waves, climbing over their own dead, exactly as doctrine prescribed. And they kept dying. When ammunition ran out, Basilone fought with his .45 pistol and a machete. By dawn, only Basilone and 2 others from his section were still standing. He was credited with at least 38 kills, though the actual number was certainly higher, and received the Medal of Honor, the first enlisted Marine so honored in World War II. "Only part of this medal belongs to me," he said afterward. "Pieces of it belong to the boys who are still on Guadalcanal." Basilone would be killed at Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, becoming the only enlisted Marine to earn both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross in World War II. On the adjacent sector, Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Paige of the 2nd Battalion 7th Marines commanded 33 men and 4 machine guns. Born in Charleroi, Pennsylvania on August 31, 1918 to Serbian immigrant parents, Paige had walked and hitchhiked 200 miles to the Marine Corps recruiting station in Baltimore at age 18 to enlist after being rejected by his local recruiting office for being both underage and underweight. He was determined to serve. When Japanese waves overran his position that October night, his men were killed or wounded one by one. Paige found himself alone, the last man standing among the dead and dying of his platoon. He moved from gun to gun, maintaining fire against the continuing assault. A Japanese bayonet slashed his left hand open to the bone. He killed his attacker with a car-bar knife and kept fighting. When reinforcements finally arrived at dawn, Paige did not stay in his position. Instead, he unclamped a Browning machine gun from its tripod, draped ammunition belts over his shoulders, and charged downhill firing from the hip, shouting, "Fix bayonets and follow me." The counterattack restored the line. 98 Japanese dead lay on the ridge, another 200 in the ravine below, according to his own account. He also received the Medal of Honor. The October offensive cost the Japanese between 2,200 and 3,000 killed, including Major General Yumio Nasu, who was mortally wounded by rifle fire while leading his men forward, Colonel Toshiro Hiroyasu of the 16th Infantry and most of his staff, and Colonel Masajiro Furimiya of the 29th Infantry. American losses totaled approximately 86 killed across the entire battle. It was the last serious Japanese ground offensive on Guadalcanal. After October, the Japanese would never again attempt to take Henderson Field by storm. The most devastating testimony of Guadalcanal's impact on Japanese forces comes not from strategic analyses, but from the diaries recovered from dead soldiers and the memoirs of the few who survived. These documents reveal a transformation from arrogant confidence to despair, starvation, madness, and an agonizing recognition that everything they had been taught about American weakness was wrong. Second Lieutenant Genjiro Inui of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company, who served from August 30th, 1942 to February 7th, 1943, kept a diary later translated into English by his son Itiru. His entries chart the descent from confident soldier to starving skeleton. The head swimming from starvation is really terrible. I cannot stand up without something to lean on. I toppled down once, had a few young buds of areca palm tree. As weeks passed, his entries grew more desperate. He recorded subordinates attempting suicide rather than continue suffering. He wrote of wounded men abandoned on the trail because there was no one strong enough to carry them. I saw a soldier who had been left behind wounded in the foot, but no tears welled up in my eyes. Starvation had stripped away his capacity for empathy, along with his strength. Probational Officer Kan Nakamura's diary, spanning September 19, 1942 to January 7, 1943, and now held at the University of Michigan Clements Library, captures the progression of desperation. On November 11th, he wrote, "I can hear the constant roar of guns from the direction of the front lines. It seems as though our forces are not firing a single shot as they have no ammunition or rations." On December 21st, with death approaching, he wrote, "I did not even dream that we could eat things like these on Guadalcanal. Well, I guess I can die any time now." He was eating grass, bark, anything that could be chewed and swallowed. His final entry, January 7th, 1943, reads simply, "I hope we will execute a night attack as I want to eat the enemy food." His fate is unknown. His diary was found on or near his body. First Lieutenant Okajima documented the institutional collapse of the Japanese army on Guadalcanal. On December 26th, he wrote, "After eating his meal, he died suddenly." This makes approximately the total losses we received in the occupation of Hong Kong and Java. Even in the face of the enemy, the men's minds were entirely occupied with thoughts of eating. On January 9th, he recorded something even more disturbing. In a certain company, it is said that the NCOs ate twice as much, and the officers 3 times as much as the men. The army's discipline was breaking down. Officers were stealing food from their own troops. On January 10th, he wrote a single devastating sentence. "It is really terrible to see electric lights go on at an enemy airfield." That image captured everything about the gulf between American abundance and Japanese deprivation. One anonymous diarist recorded on December 14th that 2 officers of the 2nd Company have been going insane. They probably have become pessimistic about the war situation. Madness was spreading through the ranks along with starvation and disease. NCO Yoshida Kashichi composed poetry that survived in historian Saburo Ienaga's book, The Pacific War. His verses captured the experience of dying slowly in the jungle. No matter how far we walk, we do not know where we are going. Our rice is gone, eating roots and grass. Blood oozes from our wounds, no cloth to bind our cuts. Flies swarm to the scabs, no strength to brush them away. How many times I have thought of suicide. Second Lieutenant Yasuo Obi, one of the few officers who survived to write the memoir Ningen no Genkai, meaning human limits, documented a grim calculus that circulated among the starving troops. Soldiers who could manage to stand on their own 2 feet would live for 30 more days. Those who could not stand but could sit up would have 3 more weeks. The men who urinated while lying down would die in 3 days. Those who could no longer talk had 2 days. Obi noted with horror that predictions based on this unscientific and inhumane theory always proved accurate. The soldiers had learned to read their own deaths in their failing bodies. The numbers behind these voices are staggering. Of Japan's approximately 25,000 dead on Guadalcanal, roughly 3/4 perished from non-combat causes, primarily starvation and disease combined. Malaria struck nearly every Japanese soldier on the island. Dysentery ravaged units that had no access to clean water. Beriberi weakened men who had no vitamins in their diet of grass and tree bark. Tropical ulcers ate through flesh to expose bone. The supply situation grew worse with each passing week. The Tokyo Express could deliver men but not the food to sustain them. Japanese soldiers were supposed to receive 800 grams of rice per day. By December, they were lucky to receive 50 grams. Some units received nothing at all for weeks. The jungle offered little sustenance. Coconuts were stripped from the trees. Land crabs were hunted to extinction in areas near Japanese positions. Men ate lizards, snakes, and insects, anything that moved. When the animals were gone, they ate grass and leaves. By December 1942, Japanese troops were dying at a rate of 50 men per day from malnutrition, disease, and Allied attacks combined. The hospitals, if they could be called that, were simply clearings in the jungle where the dying were laid in rows. There were no medicines, no bandages, and no doctors for most units. Men watched their comrades die and knew they would be next. Hyakutake himself sent a desperate communique to Tokyo on December 23rd. No food available, and we can no longer send out scouts. We can do nothing to withstand the enemy's offensive. 17th Army now requests permission to break into the enemy's positions and die an honorable death rather than die of hunger in our own dugouts. He was asking for permission to launch a final suicide attack rather than watch his army starve to death. Guadalcanal was decided as much at sea as on land, and the naval campaign was among the most savage in history. 6 major naval engagements and dozens of smaller actions cost the Allies 24 warships, including carriers Wasp and Hornet, 8 cruisers, and 14 destroyers. Japan also lost 24 warships, including battleships Hiei and Kirishima, 1 light carrier, 4 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and 6 submarines. Approximately 4,911 US and Allied sailors died in the waters around Guadalcanal, nearly 3 times the ground casualties. The campaign opened with catastrophe. At the Battle of Savo Island on the night of August 8th through 9th, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's cruiser force surprised 4 Allied heavy cruisers in one of the most devastating surface actions of the war. Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes, and HMAS Canberra were all fatally damaged in a roughly 30-minute action, killing over 1,077 sailors. HMAS Canberra was scuttled the next morning, and USS Astoria did not sink until afternoon the following day, but all 4 ships were lost. It was the worst defeat in a fair fight in US Navy history. Yet Mikawa made the critical error of not attacking the defenseless transport ships, which would have doomed the Marines ashore. His cruisers withdrew, leaving the transports to complete their unloading. It was a tactical victory that produced a strategic failure. The decisive engagement came November 12th through 15th. In the first night action, Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's cruiser-destroyer force intercepted a Japanese battleship bombardment group at ranges as close as 2,500 yards, point-blank for warships. The battle was fought at distances where sailors could see enemy ships with the naked eye, a rarity in modern naval warfare. Both Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott were killed, the only 2 U.S. admirals killed in surface action during the entire war. But battleship Hiei was crippled by accumulated damage and sunk the next day by combined air attacks from Henderson Field and USS Enterprise aircraft. In the second night action, Rear Admiral Willis Lee's battleship Washington demonstrated what American firepower could achieve. Undetected, Washington closed to 8,400 yards on battleship Kirishima and devastated her with 16-inch salvos in 7 minutes. Kirishima was hit by at least 9 16-inch shells, any one of which would have been catastrophic. She sank that night. Most critically for the land campaign, aircraft from Henderson Field and the carrier Enterprise destroyed a convoy of 11 transport ships carrying 7,000 troops of the 38th Division. The transports were caught in daylight, defenseless against air attack. American dive bombers from Henderson Field, known as the Cactus Air Force after Guadalcanal's codename, struck the convoy repeatedly throughout November 14th. Only 2,000 to 3,000 troops reached shore, and they arrived without their equipment, weapons, or supplies. Approximately 450 Japanese soldiers died in the attacks, though most survivors were rescued by escort destroyers and returned to the Shortland Islands. It was the end of any Japanese hope of reinforcing Guadalcanal with significant ground forces. The pilots of the Cactus Air Force were themselves operating under desperate conditions. Their runway was frequently cratered by naval bombardments. Their aircraft were patched together from salvaged parts. Fuel was sometimes so short that planes could make only 1 sortie per day. Pilots flew until they collapsed from exhaustion, were given a few hours of sleep, and flew again. Malaria struck the aviators as hard as the infantrymen, yet they kept flying, kept control of the daylight skies that made Japanese operations on Guadalcanal impossible. The Tokyo Express, Japan's system of using fast destroyers to deliver troops and supplies under cover of darkness, was an ingenious improvisation that nonetheless proved fatally inadequate. A single 12,000-ton cargo ship could deliver what required approximately 16 destroyer loads. Destroyers could not carry heavy artillery, vehicles, or adequate ammunition. The later drum method, dropping steel drums lashed together and pushed into the sea for shore parties to retrieve, was even more wasteful. In a typical December 1942 run, only 300 of 1,500 drums were recovered before aircraft destroyed the rest. 17th Army staff calculated that sustaining the garrison required 5 destroyer loads per night, a rate that was utterly impossible. When presented with this plan, Admiral Yamamoto called it so unrealistic that success might be unattainable. By mid-December, the Japanese Navy stopped regular destroyer runs, and Rear Admiral Tanaka told Admiral Mikawa that a continuation of these operations was hopeless and would only lead to further losses and complete demoralization. On October 13th, battleships Kongo and Haruna delivered a devastating 83-minute barrage that fired 973 14-inch shells into the marine perimeter around Henderson Field. The bombardment destroyed 48 of 90 aircraft and killed 41 men, including 6 Cactus Air Force aircrew. Craters pocked the runway. Fuel dumps burned. It was the most destructive naval bombardment American forces had endured in the Pacific. Yet even this punishment could not break American resistance. Within hours, Seabees had filled the craters, and Henderson Field was operational again. On December 31st, 1942, Emperor Hirohito endorsed the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. It was the first retreat in the Pacific War, the first admission that Japanese forces could not always win. The emperor was not at all happy, particularly questioning why Japanese units needed over a month to build an airfield that Americans completed in days. No one had an answer. Hyakutake, receiving the order on January 15th, told his troops it was a change in the disposition of troops for future offense. The lie was necessary. To admit retreat would have been to admit defeat, something Japanese military culture could not accept. Privately, he acknowledged that it is a very difficult task for the army to withdraw under existing circumstances. However, the orders of the area army, based upon orders of the emperor, must be carried out at any cost. The cost was terrible. Troops unable to walk to evacuation points were encouraged to kill themselves to uphold the honor of the imperial army. Many did. Those who could still move began the agonizing march to the evacuation beaches, leaving a trail of dead and dying behind them. Over 3 nights, February 1st, 4th and 7th, 1943, Japanese destroyers evacuated 10,652 men from Cape Esperance and Comimbo. The breakdown was 4,935 on the first night, 3,742 on the fourth, and 1,975 on the 7th. The evacuation runs were conducted with the same skill that had characterized the Tokyo Express at its best. Destroyers approached at high speed under cover of darkness, loaded men from small boats and the beach itself, and withdrew before American aircraft could catch them at dawn. The operation was codenamed Key, using the Japanese phonetic syllable as a designation, though it was presented to the troops as an advance to new positions. Many of the men carried to the beaches were too weak to climb the cargo nets, hung over the sides of the destroyers. They had to be hauled up like sacks of rice by sailors who were shocked at the condition of the army they were rescuing. These were not soldiers anymore. They were living skeletons, men whose ribs showed through their skin, whose eyes had sunk deep into their skulls, whose legs could barely support their weight. Of these survivors, 600 died before receiving medical care, their bodies too far gone to save even with treatment. 3,000 required extensive hospitalization. Many would never fully recover their health. The physical damage of starvation had been compounded by tropical diseases that would recur for years. The psychological damage was perhaps even worse. These men had been told they were invincible. They had been told Americans were weak. They had been told they would win. Everything they believed had proven false. The Allies, remarkably, were completely surprised by the evacuation. Intelligence had misinterpreted increased shipping activity as preparation for a new offensive rather than a withdrawal. Admiral Nimitz admitted that only the skill in keeping their plans disguised and bold celerity in carrying them out enabled the Japanese to withdraw. It was the one thing the Japanese did right in the entire campaign. On February 9, 1943, at 4:25 in the afternoon, Major General Alexander Pache radioed Admiral William Halsey with 2 sentences. Total and complete defeat of Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, effected 16:25 today. Advancing troops found abandoned positions littered with evidence of unimaginable suffering. Approximately 300 Americans and 20,000 Japanese remain listed as missing on the island to this day, their remains never recovered. Captain Toshikazu Ome, a former Imperial Japanese Navy staff officer, wrote in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings in January 1951 that countermeasures taken by the Japanese against the American landing on Guadalcanal Island on August 7th lacked thoroughness, owing to an underestimation of American fighting strength. It was an understatement of epic proportions. The campaign consumed 683 Japanese aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots, losses that combined with Midway and Coral Sea to gut Japan's elite naval aviation. It forced Japan permanently onto the defensive and demonstrated the futility of piecemeal reinforcement, sending small forces one after another to be destroyed rather than concentrating overwhelming strength. The Japanese themselves later termed this pattern the Guadalcanal disease. Roosevelt, learning of the November naval victory, declared that it would seem that the turning point in this war has at last been reached. The Marines who held Henderson Field endured conditions that Japanese doctrine assumed Americans could not survive. They were outnumbered for much of the campaign. They were cut off by sea after Savo Island. They subsisted on captured Japanese rice when their own supplies ran out. They were riddled with malaria, their strength sapped by tropical disease. They were subjected to nightly naval bombardments that shook the earth and killed men in their foxholes. They adapted, endured, and fought with a ferocity that rewrote Japanese assumptions about Western soldiers permanently. They established interlocking machine gun kill zones that turned every Japanese assault into a slaughter. They pre-registered artillery on every likely avenue of approach, so shells could fall within seconds of an attack. They rigged tripwires with sea ration cans filled with pebbles to warn of night infiltrators. They dug fighting positions that could withstand naval bombardment. They maintained iron fire discipline in darkness, waiting until the Japanese were close enough to ensure every round found its mark. And they counterattacked at dawn with tanks, aircraft, and bayonets, refusing to remain on the defensive when the enemy could be destroyed. The Marines on Guadalcanal also demonstrated something that Japanese doctrine had not considered. They worked together seamlessly, infantry and artillery and air, coordinating their efforts with an efficiency that multiplied their combat power. Japanese attacks were met not just by rifle fire but by shells falling precisely on predetermined targets, by aircraft arriving at dawn to strafe retreating survivors, by tanks rolling forward to crush positions that infantry alone could not have taken. This integration of arms was something the Japanese army, with its emphasis on individual warrior spirit, had never developed to the same degree. Vandergrift, reflecting after the Battle of the Tenaru on his enemy's refusal to surrender, wrote to Commandant Thomas Holcomb that he had never heard or read of this kind of fighting. These people refuse to surrender. The wounded wait until men come up to examine them and blow themselves and the other fellow to pieces with a hand grenade. The same tenacity could have been said of his own Marines. The veterans of Guadalcanal, both American and Japanese, would carry the lessons of that campaign for the rest of the war. American commanders learned that Japanese soldiers would fight to the death and could not be intimidated by overwhelming firepower alone. They learned that night fighting required different tactics than daylight operations. They learned that jungle warfare demanded close coordination between infantry, artillery, and air support. These lessons would be applied at New Georgia, Bougainville, Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Japanese commanders learned different lessons, though many refused to accept them. The invincibility of the Japanese soldier was a myth. Material superiority mattered as much as spiritual power. Americans would not break under pressure. These lessons should have changed Japanese strategy, but ideology proved stronger than evidence for most of the Imperial Army's leadership. They continued to send men into hopeless attacks, continued to underestimate American determination, continued to believe that spirit could overcome bullets, and they continued to lose. What was most shocking for the Japanese, beyond the strategic significance of the defeat, was the destruction of the myth that when they finally got the chance to meet the Americans in large numbers in open battle, in ground combat, that the individualistic materialist Westerners were just going to fold up. They did not fold. The evidence was buried in the jungle, recorded in the diaries of dead men, and carved into the memory of the 10,652 skeletal survivors who were carried off Starvation Island in the first retreat of Japan's Pacific Empire. Before Guadalcanal, Japanese officers told their soldiers that Marines were recruited from prisons and mental asylums, the only explanation they could conceive for such tenacity. After Guadalcanal, they stopped offering explanations. There were none that fit within their worldview. The Americans had proven themselves the equal of any Japanese soldier in courage, endurance, and ferocity. The myth of American weakness had died in the jungle, and with it died any realistic hope of Japanese victory in the Pacific War.